A few months ago we were in Miami hoping to watch tennis world number one Jannik Sinner up close and witness some of his amazing performances. Unfortunately, way after we bought our tickets and not long before the start of the Miami Open, Jannik Sinner was suspended by WADA, the international organization co-founded by the governments of over 140 nations, along with the International Olympic Committee, and that is based in Canada to promote, coordinate and monitor the fight against drugs in sports. For those who don't follow tennis, the decision was controversial because A. it came after two other control bodies found the athlete not guilty, and B. because the suspension was short enough not to affect the rest of the season, leading some players to think that Sinner received special treatment because of his number one status. Let's hear first what the committee had to say about Sinner.
Mr. Tiger, I want to ask you about, I think it's Jannik Sinner and that case. And of course, that had to do with the International Tennis Integrity Agency, and they determined that there was a positive test for a banned steroid. And then they decided that Sinner bore no fault or negligence for the positive test. And then WADA, about a month later, announced that it would appeal that decision. And so you've got the athlete and WADA entering into a resolution that resulted in a 3-month ban. But it seems that WADA approached that very differently from how they approached the Chinese swimmers case. And I don't know if you have insight into why you think they would have approached these cases so differently.
It's impossible based on what we've seen to give even speculation of why they were approached so differently. And what was so distressing and why you hear some of the world's top tennis players so outspoken about the unfairness now that they perceive in tennis was because how WADA treated this Sinner case, where they appealed it, rattled the sabers that it should be a 1 to 2 year suspension, and then on the eve of the hearing cut a deal with a very rarely used provision, and in their explanation attempted to say there were 67 other cases where they treated it similarly. We've went out and tried to find those cases and they're nowhere to be found. And so it raises once again this idea that WADA is unilaterally making decisions not in line with the transparency, the disclosure rules, which are absolutely mandatory. And I neglected to say it earlier, but make no mistake on the Chinese cases, even if there was contamination, Madam Chairwoman, they still had to announce those cases. They still had to disqualify those athletes. So there is no justifiable reason, these basic rules of transparency, even if it was contamination, which of course we don't believe that it was, and Gautier decided it wasn't necessarily proven, they still had to disclose them.
I want to ask you about something in your testimony. You said China has paid an extra $1.8 million. That's much more than their required dues, and they've done that since 2018, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And in 22, the Chinese earmarked $500,000 specifically for investigations in intelligence. And WADA turned a blind eye to every bit of this and allowed the Chinese swimmers to go ahead and come in. So do you believe there was a quid pro quo?
It's impossible to answer. However, what is clear is the perceived, at best case for WADA, the perceived conflict of, on the one hand, accepting, in addition to what you just mentioned, they have a private sponsorship with Aetna, the biggest Chinese, it's the Nike of China that also sponsors the Chinese swim team and the Chinese Olympic team. So they're getting extra gifts from China on the one hand, including the $500,000 you mentioned for specifically for investigation effort. And then on the other hand, they don't apply the rules, even if you believed it was contamination to China, and don't even investigate. the facts that came across their desk. So at a minimum, the perception of that is what's destroying the credibility in this system.
Well, indeed.
To be precise, most of the top players and former champions supported Sinner, while those who expressed concern are not in the top 30 or are retired players. Super champion and now number 5 Novak Djokovic, that we were able to see in Miami here in the clip, expressed concern, but in a diplomatic way. In the meantime, Sinner's huge number of followers, especially from his home country of Italy, were outraged at WADA, a body that probably nobody had heard of until then. Former tennis champion Martina Navratilova from the podium of the Tennis Channel, where she's a commentator, never minced her words. WADA had to be taken down and completely reformed. Well, Martina, you might get what you wished for. The Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, Technology and Data Privacy held a meeting recently titled WADA Shame, Swimming in Denial over Chinese Doping. The Sinner case, in fact, was not the first time that WADA made a controversial move. The anti-doping and drug control bodies in the US in particular are still waiting for some answers about why more than 20 Chinese swimmers who tested positive for a performance-enhancing drug before the Tokyo Olympics of 2020 were still allowed to compete, a decision that, according to the panelists in the committee, cost US athletes 93 medals. With the upcoming FIFA World Cup in 2026, the LA Olympic Games in 2028 and the Winter Game in 2034 in Salt Lake City, Utah, US authorities want to be sure that all athletes will play on a level field. That is, they want to make sure that they are clean. Let's watch the highlights of what the committee had to say. At the end, we highlight the reason why we think the committee will succeed in its intent.
Why it is completely implausible that the Chinese swimmers were unwittingly contaminated.
Thank you for the question, Senator Blackburn, and for your efforts, including the introduction of the Restore Confidence WADA Act that's before this subcommittee. Listen, I think we have attempted to get answers just as you all have to what really happened. We have seen what they've produced, which is very little. They appointed a very limited review of their own actions. And you don't have to take it from me. You can take it from what he determined. And he determined that they did not prove contamination and that it was just as plausible to be intentional use. You then couple that with the fact that WADA did no investigation, just blindly accepted the factual scenario that was provided by the Chinese. And in fact, months before these positive tests showed up on their desk, they had interviewed a defector, a whistleblower from China, who had indicated to them that TMZ was being given in a systemic fashion to athletes, but yet WADA leaders never brought in their independent investigative unit. They have a 16-person, very experienced investigative unit. They were not involved at all with investigating the facts of this case. TMZ is a prescription medication in some countries. It does not just show up in the kitchen. It's unbelievable to think that, Tinkerbell showed up and sprinkled it within the kitchen. The Chinese didn't find anyone using it. They didn't find it in the food. And the amount of food, the amount of contaminated drink you would have to actually eat or consume to get these levels was a few micrograms. I think we did the analysis based on the information that's out there. It's like 11 pounds of food and over, 7 gallons of liquid in order to get the levels. And to think that Chinese athletes at the top of their game are going to do that type of diet the day before an event or the day after one event before the next day's race is just absolutely ludicrous. And it's why we've asked for the questions. Why hasn't this followed the process and the protocols that are in place?
Let me ask you this, kind of following on to that. Why do you think that WADA thought they could intimidate the U.S. and the U.S. Olympic Committee and the Salt Lake City officials, and why was there a capitulation there?
Listen, I think it's what happened in Paris, I think you're referring to. I think it's Exhibit A of the value and the importance of independence in anti-doping enforcement. You have the perception that the IOC leveraged the giving of the Olympic Games in exchange for us bowing down, as Senator Cruz mentioned, to the supreme authority of WADA. Those shouldn't be commingled whatsoever. Now, we've been assured from the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee that it's meaningless. There was no quid pro quo in their mind, and we must give credit to the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee because they did make the independent decision to create USADA. You've heard from some of the other witnesses about the effective model of independence. They took the courage back in late 1999, early 2000 to say we're gonna be involved to help fund, but we're not gonna be involved from a decision-making standpoint. We're gonna remove the fox from guarding the hen house here in the United States. And we think, and Professor Kohler testified to it, we think that's made all the difference in enforcement. And unfortunately, that's not what has happened and occurred with the IOC and with the World Anti-Doping Agency. I think the silver bullet to restoring trust is independence. They promised an independent president and vice president. They betrayed that promise. And that was part of why the US back in 2020 agreed to fund WADA, was making it more independent. That was in the legislative language to the funding that US taxpayers agreed to send to WADA. And that was supposed to go into effect, but they changed the rules mid-game. A bait and switch is what happened. I do firmly believe if you put in independent president and vice president on the executive committee, which then also means it's on the foundation board, they're the same people, then we can begin the process of ensuring that it's trustworthy, that it's transparent, has accountability, and change the culture so it's not a service or lapdog to sport, but is actually a dedicated, faithful servant to clean athletes.
I also think having the independent code compliance audits is important. I think make sure there's no conflicts of interest in the leadership of WADA is important. I think independent athletes representation is important. I think strengthening our oversight of it and having that representation. What I found is if we're not at the seat, we can impact change. And we're about the most independent, and you've heard Katie talk about what US athletes do. And we want to make sure that everybody's doing it, first of all. But more importantly, we want to make sure that cheaters are not part of that system. And then, of course, engaging our corporate stakeholders and leveraging much more diplomatic channels. I think all of those things, we cannot give up our authority under the Rodchenkov Act to go after the entourage of bad actors. And that's where the supreme authority language kind of doesn't work for the United States when these games are coming to U.S., and we are so proud of those as well. Thanks.
We know WADA and their allies are going to fight this. As I said earlier, they've refused to come to the committee. They have refused to provide an explanation. I'm certain part of that is they don't want to be under oath and have to admit what is done. But Dr. Gupta, you've been somebody who made the decision to withhold those funds, and that was an impactful decision. And I want you to talk for the record for just a minute about why it is so important that Congress pass this legislation, give the ONDCP the permanent authority to oversee these funds, and then why it was important to withhold those funds.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Congress passed the authority. The first Trump administration gave us the authority to withhold it. We exercised that for the right reasons. I think it's really important in legislation to ensure that ONDCP has that oversight authority to work in conjunction closely with USADA as well as the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic committees to ensure that American athletes are getting a level playing field. And only once that is done is we pay our dues. Of course, WADA isn't a favor of conditional dues payment because the argument is, well, every country will do that, but not every country is paying $3.6 million, and that's matched by IOC, which is over $7 million. So it's a large amount. I do think we have to have both the ability to withhold funds, but also appropriate representation on the governing bodies of WADA so we can hold folks accountable as well as address the bureaucratic aspects. Sometimes, as we saw with this scandal, that often becomes the reason for delaying or deferring or deflecting really incompetence and malfeasance.
Thank you.
It should be noted that the Chinese swimmers scandal broke after an investigation conducted by the New York Times. The New York Times has a precedent. In 2015, the newspaper was the first to document the investigations conducted by the FBI and internal oversight bodies regarding illegal procedures carried out within FIFA, the governing body of football or soccer games. The investigation led to the departure of FIFA's top leadership, exactly the outcome that the anti-doping and drug control bodies in the US hope about WADA.